What you're watching here is not the exercise of the Second Amendment. What you're watching here is political hysteria, fear, ginned up on purpose with maximum dishonesty in order to get people in a state of agitation, armed people in a state of agitation.
Now, shockingly enough, in this clip, Tucker Carlson is not talking about the Republican Party base. He's actually talking about trans people.
Doesn't matter if they're trans or not, whatever that is. It's the same template always. Scare the crap out of your voters, tell them that their lives are at risk, encourage them to get guns. How do you think that ends? But by the way, if we're following the logic here, and why not? That's in short supply in this country. You have to kind of wonder, like, what's the limit to this? So if trans people are in fear for their lives in every region in the country, including New England, which apparently is crawling with Nazis now, why wouldn't we be arming them as we are, say, Ukraine's trans army? And there are famously trans people in Ukraine's army. They're very, very proud of that. So why stop with AR-15s? I mean, why not F-35s or tanks?
So this clip from Tucker Carlson is absolutely unbelievable, and it speaks to the shameless hypocrisy that exists within the right wing today. Because this is a reaction to a subset of trans people who are actively arming themselves because, and I know this is wild, there's actually a huge wave of hate crimes against trans people across the country. And many trans people, I think rightfully so, feel like their lives are actively in danger because they are threatened by a bunch of transphobic weirdos. There are quite literally neo-Nazi militias across the United States of America that are organizing themselves in such a way that is specifically directed against any public display of queerness, whether that be a drag show, or a drag story hour, or even just random attacks on queer bars. Fundamentally, the violence against queer folks has escalated significantly. And so there is a subset of trans people who are responding by arming themselves and training themselves for self-defense. And that, for some reason, gets Tucker Carlson very angry, and it gets all these Second Amendment warriors very, very upset. The idea that trans people have just as much of a right to self-defense in the Second Amendment as anybody else. But that really reveals what these right-wingers believe. You see, they believe that the Second Amendment exists solely for them to be able to have weapons in order to terrorize marginalized people. But whenever marginalized people arm themselves for self-defense, then all of a sudden they're up in arms and they're very much against the Second Amendment. And it's really funny how that works, although it is perfectly in line with the history of the United States of America. You see, these conservatives have never actually believed in a universal right to self-defense or in the Second Amendment even more broadly. They fundamentally believe that privileged people, specifically cisgender, heterosexual white men, should have access to all of the firearms they want for the sole purpose of terrorizing marginalized people. And that is how the Second Amendment has been historically applied through the United States of America. In fact, some of the biggest waves of gun legislation in the United States were direct responses to organizations like the Black Panthers putting together community defense organizations. I mean, Ronald Reagan famously pushed a bunch of gun control legislation specifically aimed at stopping black and brown folks from getting access to firearms. And this is one of the major flaws that exists within the whole conversation about gun control, because the unfortunate reality is that the policing system as a whole is largely designed to police marginalized people, which means that any type of gun control legislation will be disproportionately aimed towards marginalized people and will not be aimed much towards privileged people. And so long as that imbalance maintains itself within our policing system, then any gun control legislation will have the unbalanced effect of stripping away guns from marginalized people while not actually doing much to stop privileged people from accessing these firearms. Which is why any approach towards gun control legislation would need to first address the systemic inequalities that will by definition exist in our enforcement system as long as we maintain the system as it is. So in order for any gun control legislation to actually work to prevent the predominantly white supremacist violence that is happening towards queer folks, then we actually need to change our system of policing first. But the fact that Tucker Carlson is up in arms about groups of Americans getting access to firearms is a pretty good bit of evidence that the aim of the political right, and specifically people like Tucker Carlson, is for privileged people to have access to violent weapons with the intent and purpose of terrorizing marginalized people. Because why else would you be constantly pushing to make it easier for privileged people to have access to firearms, while simultaneously looking at marginalized people who are trying to get access to firearms and saying that they should not be allowed to have firearms, and fear-mongering about it. The only logical conclusion from that train of thinking is that what appears to be outward hypocrisy is perfect consistency, which is to say, people like Tucker Carlson tend to believe that our system should operate in a state of terrorizing marginalized people, and that marginalized people should not have any sort of right to self-defense. And that fact alone should be absolutely terrifying to anybody who considers themselves to be an ally. Because the fundamental reality is, with right-wingers like this, you simply cannot give anything that they say any weight. You cannot take what they say seriously. And you cannot pretend that any argument they're making is based out of anything other than just pure hatred. Because they will invent any point in their minds in order to justify their bigotry, which means the individual facts or details of a particular argument they make is completely irrelevant. It is just something that they think is convenient in the moment. These people are not in favor of the Second Amendment. They're not in favor of people having a right to defend themselves. They're in favor of having for themselves a right to bear arms with the intent to terrify marginalized people around them. And they think that marginalized people should not be allowed any sort of right to self-defense whatsoever.